Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. My name is Bill Benson. I have hosted the museum's First Person program since it began in 2000. Thank you for joining us today. Through these monthly conversations, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. We're honored to have Holocaust survivor Frank Lieberman share his individual personal account of the Holocaust with us. Frank, welcome. Thanks for agreeing to be our first person today.
Glad to be here.
Frank, we have so much to hear from you today, so we'll start right away. You were born in Germany in 1929, just 4 years before Hitler came to power in 1933. Will you tell us about your family and your early life in your hometown of Gleiwitz?
Gleiwitz was located between the place where my parents came from. No, it was between Beuthen, where my father's family lived, and Oppeln, where my mother's parents and siblings lived.
And here we see your parents, right?
Yes. This is in Spindlermühl, which is a resort place which was about 3 hours from Gleiwitz. And my parents loved to go there. They had both skiing in winter and hiking during the summer.
Tell us more about your parents, Frank, please.
My father was a physician, an ear, nose, throat surgeon. My mother came from a family which had lived in Oppeln for well over 150 years.
Wow.
And they had a family business which celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1933. The sign there is J.J. Orgler. It had upholstery materials on the right and drive belts on the left, Treibriemen. And of course, leather for various areas from shoemakers to people who made fancy equipment out of it.
And as you said, the business in 1933 celebrated its 100th anniversary in the family. That's incredible. How about your other side of your family, your paternal grandparents?
My father's parents had a small hardware store where my grandfather was the salesperson and my grandmother was bookkeeper. They sold basic hardware and also baby furniture and baby carriages, etc.
And notice you have being a kid, you've got a bandage on your knee there in that photograph.
I probably fell playing tag or doing something of that kind.
It sounds
Nothing
like
serious.
It sounds like you spent a good deal of time with your grandparents on both sides. You knew them.
Well, my parents bought a small car, mainly to visit both parents and stay in touch, because Gleiwitz had a streetcar network where you could get along anywhere, and there were very, very few cars. That's the reason I frequently rode my bicycle and went around town by foot.
And this was the family car here?
This is my grandparents' Steyr, which was particularly nice because it held a lot of people, and we used it for various excursions.
And that's you with your maternal grandmother in that picture,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Frank, tell us about some of the activities that you and your family did.
Well, as said, we did skiing, we liked hiking, and one of the excursions with that Steyr was to go to local forests and look for mushrooms, because my grandmother loved to cook with mushrooms. And you've probably heard that some can be quite poisonous.
Mm-hmm.
So my grandparents and my mother's siblings were quite adept at knowing what to pick. And I still remember that at the end of the picking, we all put everything on a table, and anyone could veto a mushroom which looked maybe borderline or where they weren't sure. So with many meals, we never had any problems. But
So you didn't have to argue for or against a particular mushroom. It was just the right to say, not that one.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
everybody had veto power.
Veto power. And you love mushrooms to this day, I believe.
Yes, I do.
Frank, in 1933, the Nazi regime began to enact anti-Semitic laws limiting the participation of Jews in German public life. But in Gleiwitz, where you lived, you were in a unique situation because of post-World War I border agreements between Poland and Germany. The two countries had signed a treaty that protected minorities in this border region for a 15-year period. Tell us how this treaty affected your family in those first years of Nazi rule.
This treaty was signed when Poland was really reestablished. It used to be a country and then became part of Russia and Austria. And when it was reestablished, the borders had a lot of people who spoke other languages. So there was a 15-year period where people could move and were guaranteed not to be harassed on either side of the border until they chose where they really wanted to live. That was after the plebiscite.
So essentially, there was this agreement that for a 15-year period, minorities and Jews and others would be protected from discrimination for that 15-year period. But eventually, that 15-year period, you knew this was going to end.
It was in the summer of 1936. My parents and several friends decided it'd be a good idea to be out of the country during that time to see if there would be any violence. So we took a vacation in Denmark. And when we came back, a lot of things had changed. We knew it was coming. So one of the things that I remember vividly was that I was told I had to learn how to swim because we might have to take an ocean voyage.
Yeah. Meaning your parents were already thinking about the possibility of moving. Frank, during that period before the treaty ended, in the rest of Germany, of course, the very harsh anti-Semitic laws were in effect. What was your life like during that period? Was it relatively peaceful or what during that period before it ended?
It was relatively peaceful. We did change to an all-Jewish school in elementary school in 3 classrooms within a school building. There were also, we knew what was going to happen, that we'd be restricted from going to parks, playgrounds, and we made preparations for its coming, but didn't know exactly how severe it would be.
Right. And one of the things you shared with me is during that period, kosher butchers were allowed to keep their shops open in that part of Germany where you were located. Tell us what your community did to support that kosher butcher that you had in your community.
Well, there were about 1,200 families, and there was just one congregation. In order to support those people who wanted to be kosher, everybody decided that they would use a kosher butcher, whether they were kosher or not, in order to keep them in business and help out their neighbors.
You know, Frank, the parallel in my head is if suddenly we were told the Civil Rights Act of 1965 would expire tomorrow, that you could go back to doing what happened prior to that. That's the situation you sort of faced. So when that treaty ended, how did it affect you?
A lot of things changed. When we came back, there was a lot of graffiti on the store windows of Jewish shops. There was a Stürmer display.
And that was a publication, right?
The Stürmer
Yeah.
was Goebbels' propaganda newspaper, which showed Jews as being particularly ugly, almost rather satirical figures, and were basically universal propaganda. Also, there was almost complete censorship. You weren't allowed to listen to foreign radio stations, and there were a lot of laws restricting movements and what you could do. Also, bank accounts were frozen, that you could only withdraw whatever was considered necessary for your livelihood. Also, there was a brown shirt stationed in front of our apartment house where my father also had his office, threatening people with loss of jobs and all kinds of things if they wanted to go to the office. My father also lost his ability to collect insurance. Germany always had socialized medicine, which meant that the government deducts a tax and you're entitled to go for any treatment when it's needed. So if you couldn't collect it, he basically knew that he couldn't make a living.
So between blocking people from going to his practice, taking away his ability to collect insurance, his hospital privileges, basically put him out of business as a physician.
Correct.
Frank, once the treaty passed, of course, along with all those other brutal restrictions, there were also laws that affected education of Jewish children. Jewish students were restricted to the numbers that could attend German public schools. And you described a moment ago that you were attending essentially a Jewish school inside a larger school. What changed for you from in school once those rules took effect? And I think we have a picture of your first day of school.
Yes. Those cones that everybody's holding were filled with candy in order to make school sweet.
Which, of course, now is not going to be very sweet for you. Tell us what it was like for you to go to school at that point.
Well, of course, Jews lost all rights and protection of the police. Therefore, it was important to be safe, primarily to stay away from groups. Individually, we were hard to recognize. But for instance, going to school, we were told to come 5 minutes after school started, and were dismissed 5 minutes early so that we could disperse and get home safely. We basically had a good education. The classes were fairly large because we had to do with limited space. One of the things which I do remember was that the most critical and dangerous time was during a forced recess around lunchtime, where we found it was where boys were on one side, girls were on the other, and we found it to be relatively safest to be just between them, near our teachers, to have some degree of protection.
Frank, thank you for that. You mentioned a little while ago that in anticipation of maybe taking an ocean journey, you learned to swim. As the laws became more restrictive and harsher, your parents began to think about and look for ways to leave Germany, including your mother took a trip to Palestine. Tell us why she went there and what happened.
Basically, she went there with her brother in order to investigate what the possibilities were, and found out that there was a doctor for about every 100 people. So she came back and pretty much eliminated Israel, or rather Palestine, as a place to go, because my father enjoyed his practice of medicine, and that's when we thought of going elsewhere, preferably the United States, if we could get an affidavit in order to be able to emigrate there.
So, Frank, because of what you just said, your father did end up making a trip to the United States in January of 1938 to see if it would be possible for the family to immigrate there. But the immigration process was very complicated in the 1930s. Discriminatory quotas limited how many people could immigrate to the United States from various countries, different quotas, different countries. For all potential immigrants, the bureaucratic process was onerous. It required large amounts of paperwork, and most notably, visa applicants had to get the affidavit that you spoke of.
With that affidavit, he went to the American consulate in Berlin and got a number to be called up for a physical and the actual visa, which, by the way, was going to be good for 120 days, if and when we got it. We waited for a couple of months and nothing happened. And my father called a friend and said, is there anything that I can do to expedite this? Because I'm really getting anxious. I can't make a living, and things are getting much worse. So he suggested getting a box of candy for the secretary to the consul, a certain Fräulein Schmidt. He proceeded to get a nice big box of candy, and a month later, still nothing happened. He called his friend again and said, "Didn't you put 100 marks into it?"
In other words, put money into the box of chocolate.
Into the box of candy. So she got another box of candy, and about 2 weeks later, we were called to the consulate to take a physical in order to get the final approval of the visa. At that point, my father took the next boat to the United States and got the cheapest first-class ticket, because at that time they still had rules that if you were visiting the United States, you could take a fairly substantial spending allowance, which you could then take into the United States.
That was if you sailed on a German ship, right?
Correct.
Right.
Of the North German Lloyd.
Frank, what motivated your parents to make the decision that your father would go in advance without the two of you? So you and your mom stayed behind.
Well, the requirements to practice medicine is to take the state boards in the field, and he picked Ohio because they passed 50% of the applicants, which was a fairly high percentage. So he left early in order to save money. Again, it was a depression. He couldn't work, and he had to live off this spending allowance. He rented a room in Cleveland for $5 a week and used the medical school of Western Reserve University as for the library, because he had taken English during his college days and was proficient enough to read well and get a head start.
While it was just you and your mother was having to make all the preparations for moving. So would you talk a little bit about that? And I do want you to tell us about the incident where you broke your arm.
We had a garden plot on the edge of town, which about half a dozen families, the same people who, by the way, went to Denmark during this time, which we could use as a playground, and had a cherry tree and a pear tree, and it was kind of a recreation area at the edge of town. Playing tag, I broke my arm. Of course, I was fiercely independent. I didn't tell anybody. I just said I want to go home and rode my bicycle. And of course, one couldn't call an ambulance or anything like that, because that you probably wouldn't get serviced.
Right.
Therefore, I was able to ride with one arm. My mother immediately called the orthopedist in the local hospital, whom she knew because they, with professional events, they had dinner with them, and she thought that was the most likely place to go. Mm-hmm. When she called him, he said, "Sorry, I don't treat Jewish patients. I can't help you." She frantically called various other places and did find somebody in Boynton, which where my father had grown up, who said, take a taxi and go to the back entrance of the Catholic orphanage in Boynton. I'll see you there and I'll take care of it. But be sure to go through the back entrance because I don't want to be seen with you. He did set my arm and gave my mother instructions on what to tell my pediatrician when she took the bandage off after about 6 weeks and gave me physical therapy, and my arm is in fine shape. In fact, it bends even better than my right arm.
Frank, that little incident you just described speaks volumes. Something as straightforward as a broken arm in a child, it was that difficult to get care for you. You can imagine what it was like for other Jews who had any kind of illness or anything. Thank you for sharing that. As a child, what gave you strength to get through those difficult days?
My parents gave me a lot of independence. In other words, cars were not a danger, so that I pretty much went to see friends, go to the playground, do things by myself, and you develop instincts of what you could do and what you couldn't do. And I must have had the right instincts because I managed very well.
So, Frank, here you are with your mom. She is having to try to figure out what she could take with her to the United States to arrange that, which was an ordeal. I would like you to say just briefly what that involved, because I think it's extraordinary what it meant to take anything out. You had to pay an extraordinary tax. And I want you to tell us about how your grandparents reacted to you and your mom and dad moving to the United States, and when you last saw your grandparents.
Well, first of all, the rules at that time were still relatively lenient, that you could take anything along that you had been using, and rather if you paid 100% tax on its value. Now, since money was frozen, it really did. We used it in order to try to make life as inexpensive when we got to the United States as possible. My mother arranged for a lift, which is like a container today, in which we were able to take basic furniture, my father's office furniture, like instruments. She even was able to buy a new audiometer, which is a machine which tested hearing loss. Mm-hmm. That was one of the things I liked to play with in the office, because you could turn on and off various frequencies in order to test the whole range. Mm. It was a brand new invention at the time that he used very well when he got to the United States.
So your mom she's trying to make sure she can take things that are going to be essential to the family and essential to your father getting started in his practice. We have
She also arranged for the packing. Friends, by the way, offered to pay rather to pack my bicycle, which I was very fond of, mm-hmm. and said that they can put it in a small box to make it to take as little room on the lift as possible. So they brought it to us, and when the lift came, a customs inspector checked everything off to see that it was properly taxed, and then sealed it, and it was shipped off to the United States.
Frank,
this was in the beginning of October.
We have a photograph here of you with your mother and your maternal grandparents. This, I believe, was taken the last time you saw your grandparents What do you recall of what that was like for you and for your mom?
Well, my grandfather was quite upset that my father was taking his only daughter to a place that's very far away, but did understand the circumstances.
Mhm.
We stopped there. This is already a suit that I got for emigration. It came with a pair of shorts, which were usually what kids wore, and also a pair of knickerbockers of the English style, which went pretty far down. And this was kind of a goodbye photograph.
Mhm.
And my mother's brother accompanied us to the ship.
The ship was able to sail. You made it to the United States, and you and your mother were reunited with your father in late October of 1938, and your family settled in Ohio. Tell us what the adjustment was like for your family and for you particularly to establish yourself in a new country, a new life.
Again, I considered it an adventure. My mother told me everything would be better when we got to the United States. And after a rather perilous sea voyage where she was sick and wasn't able to get out of the cabin for 4 days, because in October that was in the hurricane season,
Mhm.
and we had a very, very rough voyage. But I considered everything an adventure.
Mhm. Mhm. And we have a photograph, I think, coming up that
Yes.
that sort of summarizes for you what your adjustment was like. That's what we'd call an all-American picture, isn't it?
Actually, my father picked us up in New York, and after the 2-day sightseeing trip in New York, where for 5 cents you could get on the Fifth Avenue bus and go through Central Park, the Empire State Building, and a lot of New York. We proceeded to Cleveland, where he was studying and where we stayed for about 3 months
But
because he was booked to do his state boards in December.
in December. So, Frank, before you move on to that, of course, you hadn't been in the United States very long. You were in Cleveland for a very short while. When you were home and your parents were out, and a phone call came from Germany. Tell us about this.
Yeah, my parents went out for the first time, I believe it was a Wednesday, in order to get a special of a midweek sale of a movie. I don't know whether it was 10 cents or 25, but that was their first going out. And they asked a neighbor to kind of look in on me every half hour. At about 9 o'clock that night, the phone rang. I answered, and it was a person-to-person phone call from my mother, from my grandparents. That was probably the longest hour of my life
Mhm. Mhm.
because I knew something was definitely wrong, since 9 o'clock at night was 3 o'clock in the morning in Germany. And they called person to person, which there were 2 classes at that time when phoning was very expensive. You could call station to station, where the person answered and whoever it was connected. If you really wanted to get a particular person, you called person to person, which was about 2-3 times as much, but obviously the news wasn't going to be good.
Mhm.
Finally, my parents came back at about 10 o'clock and heard the news from my grandparents that the business had been confiscated, that 2 of my mother's brothers were imprisoned, and that the business, and that things were in shambles. And this was what's known as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, when hundreds of synagogues were burned down, stores were confiscated, and that I consider is the beginning of the Holocaust.
Mhm. And that was the night of November 9th through 10th, 1938, just literally about 2 weeks after you arrived in the United States. That must have been just so terrifying for your mom and dad to know that that was going on with the rest of the family in Germany. You would, as you said, you remained in Cleveland while your father was preparing for his boards. So you started school while you were in Cleveland. What was that like for you? I mean, first of all, you're in not only a new culture, but a new language.
Well, I had been tutored for about 4 months when we definitely decided that we were able to leave for the United States. I'd been tutored in English, so I knew some English, and at that time there were no TESOL or programs for speakers of other languages.
Mhm.
So they simply put us back about a year, and I was very happy to have a very, very friendly and helpful third grade teacher in manual who spent some time after school to help me and to figure out what I knew and what I didn't know, and where I needed help, and where in some cases I was ahead, depending on the curriculum.
Frank, your father, now he picked Ohio because they passed 50%, one half of those who took the state boards, but your father fortunately was one of those who did pass when he took it. So your father, it was time for him to rebuild his medical practice in Ohio. So tell us what that was like for your father to begin to rebuild his practice. I think you moved to Dayton, Ohio, to do that.
Right, he moved to Dayton because there was no Jewish ear, nose, throat surgeon. And it was suggested that that would be a good place. He did open his practice on Valentine's Day, 1939. And that's when we started our new life.
But it was a rocky start there for a moment with his practice. Please tell us about that.
All right. At that time, the key to legitimacy was to be accepted in the medical society. He immediately put in an application for it, and the result was that they decided to have an emergency meeting on a Friday night where they passed an ex post facto law requiring citizenship for any new members. the process of becoming a citizen takes 5 years. So that obviously was meant to do a roadblock for his for resettlement in Dayton. Now, one of my favorite saying is, when you get a lemon, try to make lemonade. As it happened, somebody called the Dayton Herald, or with the Journal Herald, I think the two had merged, which was the Republican morning newspaper. And the reporter came in, rather called that he wants to see his credentials. He came in on Saturday morning, spoke to my father probably for about half an hour to get his background, and said thank you. The next morning, the Dayton Journal Herald had an editorial captioned "Freedom of Opportunity in the United States," in which they described what had gone on, the fact that the meeting was on a Friday night, which was restricted to some Jewish physicians, and that this law had been passed, and Monday morning, my father had 11 new patients.
As a result of that editorial appearing in the
As a
newspaper.
result of that editorial.
And that was the start of
I
his.
have been a great supporter of a good free press.
I can see why. Frank, as we get towards the end of the program, several other things are really important for you to share with us. As you described, your father was unsuccessful in getting other family members out of Germany. Please tell us what happened to your family members, and then about what he did to bring people out of Germany after the war, which is just remarkable. But first, tell us about the rest of your family.
Unfortunately, none of them really made it. My mother's two twin brothers were both on an Italian ship on the way to Shanghai, which was one place where one could still go. At the time when the Nazis invaded France and Italy decided to declare war, and therefore the ship couldn't get through the Panama Canal.
Suez Canal, right? Yep.
And they went back, and we never knew the exact history, except that a few years ago, when the archives came out, I did find out that the two brothers, Heinz's wife and daughter, all ended up in Auschwitz. My grandparents on both sides went to Theresienstadt. My father's father died almost immediately when he got there, and the other ones were transported out in 1944. We didn't know this until after World War, until the war was over, because, again, you just didn't hear anything.
No, and
therefore, my father couldn't do anything for his family, but by that time, by the end of the war, there were many, many displaced persons in various camps who couldn't get back to the places where they came from. And he was a volunteer head of the Jewish Family Service in Dayton, and gave, I think, 107 affidavits of guarantees that people wouldn't be on welfare during 1945 and through 1948, when the crisis really was the most severe. And as a result, was a very proud recipient of the international highest anniversary award, together with President Truman.
So President Truman and your father were recipients of this award.
There were 5.
Yeah,
but
5, and they were 2 of them. And Frank, just so our audience understands, 107 people came to the United States successfully because your father made that commitment, financial commitment to support them if need be, and gave them the affidavits. That's just remarkable. How did the effects of harassment that you experienced as a child, how do they affect you today?
I'm very sensitive to any injustice. And I guess it gives me an outlook that if everybody does well, we all do well, and it's helpful for our country and the world. And I believe in supporting the general welfare wherever I can.
Frank, I have just one more question for you today, and that is, in the face of rising global anti-Semitism, tell us why you continue to share your firsthand account of what you went through, what you experienced during the Holocaust.
I think it's important, and I kind of repeat, that if everybody does well, we all do well. And I try to fight tribalism and injustice because it's just good for the general welfare. That's why I support the museum. I also like to say that the museum is a wonderful institution because it fights injustice and calls attention to it. And I just think it's a wonderful institution.
Frank, thank you so much for being willing to be our first person today. You have shared with us as much as you could in this 1 hour, and there was so much more for you to say, but you have given us such a powerful look at what it meant to try to, when you made the decision that you wanted to get out of Germany, how difficult the barriers, the hurdles that existed. And just thank God that you and your mom and dad were successful. And thank you for sharing that with us.